All right, we are back on Morning Line. It's our final segment this morning, talking about voter turnout and what we expect among some of the minority core groups. With us this morning is Dr. Brian Russell, Political Science Professor at Tennessee State University. All right, let's talk now. We've talked about the African-American vote, and we talked about whether or not people are going to vote for someone because they're male or female, along those lines. As far as the Hispanic vote, we touched on that a bit. And you commented that you feel that, the Hispanic vote, there may be more than you would think, perhaps supporting President Trump. And there may be some very good reasons on that. Of course, the president has been very strong on his stand when it comes to immigration and issues like that, and some of the things he said about folks from Mexico and the like. And so for some, it's surprising. But what would you say is the reason that, a portion of the Hispanic population seems to gravitate toward this president?
Well, I would say there'd be a couple of factors. First, oftentimes when we talk about minority voters in our society, especially being part of the majority population, sometimes we talk about minority voters like they're a monolith and they have, one range of views. And Hispanics in our country are going to be incredibly diverse. When we talk about Hispanic population, we're talking about people from very different historical countries with very different types of systems, And then so also when we think about Hispanics tend to be religious and socially conservative. And so that is definitely going to have appeal with the Republican Party. Also, Hispanic Americans, like other Americans, believe in a strong economy. And a lot of people vote on economic issues. And then so before the pandemic, we've heard President Trump say this a lot, but before the pandemic, I was just reading the New York Times yesterday, a new report had come out that the poverty rate in our society had dropped to the lowest point in history. And of course, we see President Trump all the time talking about the incredible low unemployment rate for African Americans and Hispanic Americans and for women. And then so that is going to be the appeal. The appeal is going to be economics. There's also going to be an appeal on cultural, kind of socially conservative, religious background types of issue questions. And so, and there's also being played up, and if you check, conservative media and paying attention to what's going on over there, during the Democratic primaries, there's been a move in the Democratic Party. There's been a movement of people identifying themselves as Democratic socialists. So that's the Bernie Sanders movement, the AOC movement. And so that has kind of colored the Democratic Party and has kind of put this, some people, the Democrats aren't socialists, but a significant part of the Democratic coalition are making a socialist claim. And I think something that's been highlighted on the right here is that a significant number of Hispanic Americans are going to have been immigrating or descending from people who immigrated to our country from places, Cuba and Venezuela, for example, where there are socialist systems and that haven't produced the type of socialist paradise. And so there's some speculation. I'm starting to see this. I don't know how much of this is being manufactured, but Hispanics coming from countries that have socialist traditions. And so that is something that President Trump is playing up this time.
All right. And let's take a look on the other side of the coin then. Obviously, Joe Biden, and what he's going to try to do to appeal to a larger segment, a larger group of these various whether it's the African-American vote or the Hispanic vote, beyond that, women, where he stands right now, and you imagine that he and his platform and his VP may have more appeal for many of those groups. What does he have to do at this point to make sure he gets as many of those votes as possible?
Well, one thing that he can do, and I think right now in the election cycle, I think that President Trump is polling higher among Hispanic voters than he did in the last election. And I believe that Joe Biden is pulling a smaller percentage of those voters than Hillary did. That's what the polling right now. And so one of the things that Joe Biden has had going for him is Joe Biden is kind of identified with, kind of working class groups, working class of Americans. And I think that that is a place where Biden is going to try to reach out more. And we saw in the primary that maybe Bernie Sanders had a little bit more support than Joe Biden, but that is definitely a group of Americans that Joe Biden is going to have to reach out to. And we can see in particular places when we're talking about this, right, there's going to be a couple of elections that are very important this time around. Like, for one example, Florida is going to be a big, important state. That is a state that tends to go, back and forth and can vote for either candidate. And that is a state that has a large Hispanic population. So part of winning Florida, which is going to be a battleground state, Trump, almost can't have a victory without winning Florida. And it's going to be very important to Joe Biden also. And so both groups are going to have to reach out to Hispanic groups in Florida. And the Hispanic groups in Florida, there is a disproportionate influence of people from Cuba who tend to be more economically and socially conservative.
As we wrap things up here, just a couple of minutes then, is it your opinion, though, that as we enter into this, election now, that the turnout with regard to these core groups of Hispanics and African Americans will decide this election?
It is going to make a difference. It is going to make a difference. Oftentimes when we're talking about Democratic voters, oftentimes we'll say, you hear people talk about African Americans being the backbone of the party, right? They are very consistent voters. I think in elections nationally, what makes the difference, especially for Democrats, is high turnout among African Americans. If we have a high turnout among African American voters, that's going to give the Democrats the margin of victory in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan. President Obama won his 2 elections with increasing turnout. Obama's first election cycle was one of the highest turnout rates for young Americans since 1992. Basically, since young Americans have been voting, basically since the 80s, young Americans turn out less than 50%. And there's only 2 times since like 1980 they turned out more than 50%. That was Bill Clinton's first election. That was Barack Obama's first election. The Democrats, if they get African Americans to come out in high numbers, if they get young people to come out in high numbers, and they don't lose ground with Hispanic voters, that's a winning prescription for the Democratic Party.
Gotcha. I just hope everyone does get out to vote, however you choose to vote. That's really what it comes down to. And it is always interesting, of course, on presidential elections compared to all the other elections combined, there's always more turnout for that. There's just so much more going on and people want to vote for the president, right?
That's absolutely right. And those are high turnout, high intensity information elections. Everybody's paying attention. And so that's why those elections tend to be more turnout than midterm elections. Yeah,
it's going to be interesting to watch as we move forward on this. I'm just curious, do you talk a lot about this in your classes? Again, is regard to the young people, do you think, at least what you see there at TSU, that they're motivated to vote?
They are motivated to vote. I'm a little bit surprised that they're not a little bit more excited about the Kamala Harris-Joe Biden ticket, but they are excited to vote. And many of my students are motivated to go out and vote in opposition to President Trump. And we are talking about this a lot, and we're talking about this election cycle, and there's a lot of things going on, a lot of things to talk about.
Gotcha. Well, we talked a lot this morning, and I really appreciate you joining us, Professor Russell. It's good to talk to you, and it just gives us some insight into what to expect. Less than 2 months. Can you believe it? It's almost here. So, listen, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Maybe we can do this again.
Fantastic. I appreciate you having me, and I've enjoyed it also.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. It was a good conversation. Thank you much, sir. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we will wrap things up, have a programming note about tomorrow right after this. Stay with us.